Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 2, International Trade Theory. This chapter answers a very old question. Why do countries trade with each other? We'll meet several thinkers, scholars. We'll meet mercantilists. We'll meet classic scholars such as Adam Smith and David Ricardo. We'll meet modern economists as well. Each one gives us a piece of the answer. By the end of this lecture, you'll understand why almost every economist today supports free trade. You'll also understand why, in the real world, governments still often limit trade. Let us begin with our learning objectives. Here are our learning objectives for today. First, we'll understand the different theories that try to explain why international trade happens. Second, we'll understand why most economists today believe that free trade benefits everyone, even though this was not always the accepted view. Third, we'll understand how things like a country's resources, its workers, and its technology shape what it trades and with whom. Fourth, and very importantly, we'll connect all of these theories to real decisions that business managers make today, including how they respond to trade wars and tariffs. Let us start at the very beginning of this story, several hundred years ago. Our first module asks a simple question. Why do nations trade at all? Over the last few hundred years, several major theories try to answer this question. Some theories came from governments trying to protect their own wealth. Other theories came from economists trying to prove that trade actually benefits everyone. We'll move through these theories roughly in the order they appear in the history. This will help you see how our understanding of trade slowly improved over time. This is a timeline of trade theories. This timeline gives you the big picture before we dive into details. In the 1600s, mercantilism was the dominant idea, and it encouraged the countries to limit trade and preserve gold. In 1776, Adam Smith introduced the theory of absolute advantage and argued that trade could benefit everyone. Probably you're familiar with the name of Adam Smith. Adam Smith is called as a father of economy. He wrote a book, he authored a book named Wealth of Nation. So Wealth of Nation became like globally so popular at that time. So he became very renowned scholar. 1817, David Ricardo refined this into the theory of a comparative advantage, which remains one of the most important ideas in all economics. In the early 1900s, two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Olin, they explained trade patterns using a country's resources, which we call factor endowments. In the 1960s, Raymond Vernon proposed the product life cycle theory. And in the 1980s, new trade theory and Michael Porter's diamond model added even more insight, especially for modern, high technology industries. Now, let us look at each of these in turn, starting with the mercantilism. Mercantilism was an economic idea that became popular in Europe in 1600s. The core idea was simple. A country should export as much as possible and import as little as possible. The goal was to build up a trade surplus, which means exporting more than importing. Any surplus will be collected in the form of gold and silver, which mercantilists saw as true national wealth. So they saw gold and silver as the true wealth of the nation. To make this happen, governments use the tools like tariffs on imports so they can minimize the imports, and subsidies to help their own exporters. They support exporters to export more, so they provide some supporting money. In other words, mercantilism supported the heavy government involvement in trade, which is not free trade. One key idea inside mercantilism is the zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a situation where one side's gain always equals another side's loss. If one earns money from export, then the other side always loses by importing that. So it's a zero-sum. Think of it like slicing a pizza. If I take a bigger slice, you're forced to take a smaller one. Mercantilists view the international trade exactly this way. If one country was winning through trade, they believed another country had to be losing. This idea shaped government policy for centuries, and it explains why countries fought so hard to protect their own industries and limit foreign imports. As we'll see in the next few slides, later economists proved this zero-sum thinking was actually wrong. Mercantilism was a popular economic system in Europe from the 16th to the 18th century. The main goal of this system was to make a nation as rich and powerful as possible by accumulating gold and silver. To achieve this, governments strictly controlled the economy by encouraging exports and discouraging imports through high taxes. Nations also conquered colonies to take their cheap raw materials and force them to buy the home country's manufactured goods. So they utilized colonies to force them to purchase their manufactured goods and sourcing the very, very cheap raw materials to manufacture the products. This system eventually declined in the late 18th century as the idea of free trade and open markets became more popular and more reasonable. Mercantilism has some serious local problems. Think about it carefully. Not every country in the world can run a trade surplus at the same time, because one country's export is another country's import. The math simply does not work for everybody at once. Also, blocking imports to protect local industry usually hurts countries' own consumers, who end up paying higher prices and having fewer choices. Later economists, starting with Adam Smith, proved that trade is not actually a zero-sum game. Trade can create real benefits for both sides at once. Still, you will notice that some of this old mercantilist thinking has never fully disappeared. Today, we sometimes call this neo-mercantilism, when a country still tries hard to protect its own industries and push its exports. Module 2, the case of free trade. Our second module covers the two most famous free trade theories in economics. First, we'll look at Adam Smith's theory of absolute advantage, which was published in 1776. Then we'll look at David Ricardo's theory of comparative advantage, which was published in 1817. Together, these two ideas built the foundation for almost everything we believe about free trade today. Both thinkers were writing partially as a direct response to mercantilism, and both wanted to show that government control over trade was not actually helping ordinary people. Keep in mind that these two theories were written more than 200 years ago. Yet, economists and policymakers still quote them constantly today. That tells you how powerful and lasting these ideas really are. In 1776, Adam Smith introduced the theory of absolute advantage. A country has an absolute advantage when it can produce a good more efficiently than any other country, meaning it uses fewer resources to take the same amount. Smith argued that a country should specialize in producing the goods where it holds its advantage. Then, instead of trying to make everything itself, it should trade with other countries to get goods it does not produce efficiently. So this was a revolutionary idea at the time because it directly challenged mercantilism. Smith was saying that trade is not about winning and losing. Trade is about using the world's resources more wisely. Let us look at a simple example. Imagine two countries, country A and country B, and two goods, rice and wheat. The table shows how many hours of labor each country needs to produce 1 unit of each product. Country A needs only 2 hours to produce rice, but 6 hours to produce wheat. Country B needs 8 hours to produce rice, but only 3 hours to produce wheat. Country A is clearly more efficient at growing rice. Country B is clearly more efficient at growing wheat. According to Adam Smith, the smart move for country A to specialize in rice, for country B to specialize in wheat, and then for the two countries to trade with each other. This way, both countries end up with more rice and more wheat than if they had tried to produce everything themselves. Does it make sense, right? And to help you have a better, clear understanding about this concept, I prepared extra slide. Okay, in this case, you can imagine the red line and purple line. This represents possible production curve. Different countries have a different utilizations of resource. So some countries, they're good at making this, but some countries are good at making this. So different countries will have a different production curve, right? In this case, Korea has better production efficiency in producing TV, and Ghana, with a purple graph, the purple line, has better production efficiency for cocoa. Assume that Korea is making only TV, then they can make 20 TV, but 0 cocoa. And Ghana, let's say they make only cocoa, then they make 20 cocoa, but 0 TV. If they decide to do both, then 10 cocoa and 5 TV. That's what Ghana can produce. And if Korea decides to make both of them, then 10 TV and 2.5 cocoa is what they can produce. So based on this assumption, let's take a look at the chart. Cocoa, when they make a half and half, 10 and 5 and 10 and 2.5, right? So Ghana can make 10 cocoa, 5 TV, Korea 2.5 and 10 TV. So total production, both of the country can generate is 12.5 for cocoa and 15 for TV. But what if they trade? What if it's free trade, not like mercantilism, but free trade? And if they share their products, what happens? So each country can focus on what they can do the best. Ghana focus on producing cocoa for 20, so they can produce 20 cocoa, but 0 TV. And Korea produce 0 cocoa, but they can produce 20 TV. So total production, combining 2 countries together, will be 20 cocoa and 20 TV. Compare with these numbers, 12.5 versus 20, 15 versus 20. Can you see clearly how the free trade is working? They boost both countries' economy up. So this idea leads us to an important term, the gain from trade. The gains from trade are the extra output the world produces when countries specialize and then trade, compared to a world where every country tries to produce everything alone. Think about our rice and wheat example again. If country A tries to grow its own wheat and country B tries to grow its own rice, both countries would waste a lot of labor using inefficient. By specializing, trading instead, the 2 countries together end up with more total rice and more total wheat. That extra amount is the gain from trade. This is the key insight that broke down the old mercantilist idea of trade as a zero-sum game. Trade, if it's done well, can be a positive-sum game, where both sides come out ahead. So Adam Smith's absolute advantage sounds perfect, right? It makes sense in every case. But after like 40, 50 years later, one scholar found the shortfall of Adam Smith's theory. Let me give you a question. Assuming that many nations have higher productivity in some country, have higher productivity in every sector than the other nation or weaker nation. Is there any reason for them to trade with weaker nations? Like in the Ghana and Korea case, like Korea was more specialized in TV, but less specialized in cocoa, and Ghana was the opposite. But let's assume like one country is all good, all better in every sector. So this was absolute advantage. One part was better than the other country, right? But let's assume one country is better at every sector than this country. Then does this country need to trade? That's the question. To explain about that, I need to introduce about David Ricardo's comparative advantage. In 1817, David Ricardo took this idea one giant step further with his theory of comparative advantage. Ricardo's insight was surprising, and it's still considered one of the most important ideas in all of the economics. He showed that a country should specialize in what it produces relatively most efficiently. Relatively is one key word. And trade for everything else. This is true even if that country could actually produce the other good more efficiently than its trading partner. In other words, even a country that is better at making everything should still specialize and trade, because trade lets everyone use their time and resources in the most productive way possible. This sounds a little strange at first, so let us walk through an example on the next slide. Here's a classic example. Country A and country B Country A can make both clothes and wine faster than country B. Country A needs 2 hours for clothes and 3 hours for wine. Country B needs 6 hours for clothes and 5 hours for wine. At first glance, you might think country A should just make everything itself, since it's faster at both goods. But Ricardo shows us this is not the best choice. Look closely at the numbers. Country A is twice as fast at making wine, but 3 times as fast at making clothes. So country A's relative strength, its competitive advantage, is the clothes, which is relatively, comparatively advantageous. So the best outcome is for country A's to specialize in clothes and country B to specialize in wine and then trade. This produces more total clothes and more total wine for both countries combined. This example is very close to the one Ricardo himself used, comparing England and Portugal producing clothes and wine. So he observed the trade case between England and Portugal in this industry, and then he could get the empirical idea. It has been taught in economics classes for over 200 years because it makes an unusual idea quickly understand. To help you understand better, let's assume Ghana is more efficient in production in both cocoa and rice. Ghana has an absolute advantage in production of both products. In Ghana, it takes 10 resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa and 13.3 resources to produce 1 ton of rice. So efficiency of utilization of resources is one of the key to compare. So thus, given its 200 units of resources, Ghana can produce 20 tons of cocoa and no rice, 15 tons of rice, but no cocoa. So 15 and 20. Or any combination in between on its production possible curve, 7.5 and 10, or 15 and 3.75. That's what they can produce. Let's look at Somalia. It takes 40 resources to produce 1 ton of cocoa, 20 resources to produce 1 ton of rice. Thus, Somalia can produce 5 tons of cocoa and no rice, or 10 rice and no cocoa. Thus, without trade, Ghana will produce 10 cocoa and 7.5 rice, while Somalia will produce 2.5 cocoa and 5 rice. Now, back to the question. Ghana has absolute advantage in the production of both goods, right? Why should it trade with Somalia? Although Ghana has an absolute advantage in production of both cocoa and rice, it has a competitive advantage in production of cocoa. They use less resource to produce more products. So Ghana can produce 4 times as much cocoa as Somalia, but only 1.5 times as much rice. Ghana is comparatively more efficient at producing cocoa than it's producing rice. Without trade, the combined production of cocoa will be 12.5, and the combined production of rice will also be 12.5. Without trade, each country must consume what it produces. By engaging in trade, the two countries can increase their combined production of rice and cocoa, and consumers in both nations can consume more of both goods, like 13.75. So it was improved from 12.5 to 15, 12.5 to 13.75. So this brings us to one of the biggest conclusions in this chapter. Ricardo's theory shows that free trade is a positive-sum game, not a zero-sum game. A positive-sum game means that the total gains created are greater than the total losses. When countries specialize based on competitive advantage and then trade freely, total world production actually increases. This is the exact opposite of what the mercantilists believed. Mercantilists thought one country's win always meant another country's loss. Ricardo proved the trade, if done freely, they can make everyone better off at the same time. This single insight is why most economists today strongly support free trade policies. Like any simple model, Ricardo's theory makes some simplifying assumptions that do not perfectly match the real world. It has a shortfall as well, like Adam Smith. The basic model only considers two countries and two goods, when in reality, there are many countries and many thousands of goods, right? It assumes there are no costs to transport goods between countries. That is unrealistic, right? So we need the transportation and it costs. And it assumes that workers and resources can move easily from one country to another inside the country, which is often difficult in practice. Because of this, in the real world, some workers and some industries do lose out when trade increases, at least in the short term. A textile worker in a country that stops producing textile then may struggle to find a new job quickly. So the unemployment rate will increase dramatically, very quickly. Still, even with these limitations, the core insight remains powerful. Overall, free trade tends to increase total wealth, even if the wealth is not always shared equally right away. Ricardo's theory explains competitive advantage, but it does not fully explain where that advantage comes from. To explain about that, two Swedish economists, Heckscher and Olin, answered this question in 1900s. They introduced the idea of factor endowments. Factor endowments are simply the resources a country has available, such as land, labor, and capital. Their theory says that countries will export goods that use their abundant resources heavily and import goods that use their scarce resources heavily. For example, a country with a lot of farmland but few factories will likely export agricultural products. A country with a lot of skilled workers and advanced machinery will likely export manufactured goods. Let us look at concrete example next. Let's make a factor endowments more concrete. Imagine a country with a very large population and many available workers, but not much advanced machinery. This country is labor abundant. It will likely specialize in exporting goods that require a lot of labor, such as clothing or simple assembly work. Now imagine a different country, one with advanced factories, skilled engineers, and a lot of accumulated machinery and technology. This country is capital abundant. It'll likely specialize in exporting capital-intensive goods such as cars, machinery, and semiconductor products. This theory helps explain many real trade patterns we see today. That's one reason why some countries focus on manufacturing textiles, while others focus on manufacturing semiconductors. So far, the theories we discussed treat a country's advantages as fixed, but in the real world, advantages can change over time. New products get invented, technology shifts, companies grow bigger and gain new advantages. Our third module looks at more modern, dynamic theories that capture this changing picture. We'll look at the product life cycle theory, a new trade theory, Michael Porter's diamond model. These theories were developed much more recently than Smith and Ricardo, mostly in 20th century, because economists need better tools to explain fast-moving, high-technology industry that did not exist in earlier centuries. So modern scholars have to fill up the gap. In the 1960s, economist Raymond Vernon proposed the product life cycle theory. This theory says that where a product gets made changes over time as the product itself matures. So if you look at the graph, it looks like this. Let me go over like a step by step. So stage one is introduction. It's like the birth of a product. So this is first stage. Imagine a highly innovative brand, new product, like the smartphone. Where is it born? Usually in a wealthy, technologically advanced country, like the United States. Why? Because you need high-tech engineers and infrastructure. You need the infrastructure to hire such a good employee pool to build it and to research it. And you need wealthy consumers who are willing to buy such expensive product. At this stage, production stays 100% local. So for example, like Nike, like 60, 70 years ago, it was produced in the US. So at this stage, production stays 100% local. And the company only exports a tiny amount to other rich countries. Next comes the growth stage. The product becomes a huge hit. The demand is, increasing dramatically, not just at home, but all over the world. To keep up, the company starts mass producing it. But here's the catch. Other advanced countries, like in Europe or Japan, they start wanting to copy it. So to protect their market share and avoid high shipping costs or tariffs, the original company starts building factories inside those other developed countries. So that's the phenomenon observed in growth stage. The maturity stage. Then we hit maturity stage. Now the product is completely standardized because many manufacturers are making and they know how to make it. So it became not innovative, it became standardized. Everyone knows how to make it. The technology is not secret anymore. Because anyone can build it, companies stop competing on innovation or high value and start competing on price. To cut costs, production shifts away from rich countries and moves to developing nations, where labor and factory costs are much cheaper. Stage 4 is decline or reverse import. Why I call reverse import? You have to pay attention. Finally, we reach this stage, and this is the most surprising part of the theory. Production in the original inventing country completely stops because it's too expensive. Instead, those low-cost factories in developing countries are now mass producing the item so cheaply that they actually ship it back to the inventing country. This is called reverse import. The country that invented the product is now simply importing it. This theory helps explain why manufacturing so often moves from wealthy countries toward developing countries as a product matures. Important point is that the trade patterns are not fixed forever. They evolve as products and technology mature. Product life cycle, to summarize one more time, a new electronic gadget is first designed and made in a wealthy country. As demand grows worldwide, production expands to more countries. Once the design is standardized, factories often move to lower cost countries. The original inventing country may eventually import the very product it invented. That's called the reverse import. Now let's talk about new trade theory. So this theory was emerged in 1980s to explain trade patterns that older theories could not fully capture, especially in modern high technology industries. A central idea here is economies of scale. Economies of scale are the cost advantages of a company gains as it produces larger volumes. As total production rises, the average cost of making each unit tends to fall. Some industries, like aircraft manufacturing or semiconductor production, require such enormous production volumes to be efficient that only a few companies in the whole world can compete. This helps explain why certain global industry end up dominated by just a small number of very large firms rather than many small competitors spread evenly across many countries. New trade theory also highlights first mover advantages. A first mover advantage is the economic and strategic benefit a company gains by being the very first to enter a market or an industry, because many high technology industries have strong economies of scale. The first company to reach a large production volume can lock in lower costs even before its rivals ever catch up. This creates a powerful self-reinforcing advantage. The barrier is so high. The commercial aircraft industry is a classic example. For decades, this industry has really only supported two major global competitors, largely because of the huge economies of scale involved and the advantages each early leader built up over time. So two companies are Boeing and Airbus. Our final major theory comes from Michael Porter. Michael Porter sounds familiar to you if you took my business strategy class. It's a great reminding name, right? So Michael Porter was a professor at Harvard Business School, and Porter asked a slightly different question. Instead of asking why countries trade, he asked why certain countries produce world-leading firms in certain industries. Porter argued that four broad attributes of a nation shape whether its companies can succeed globally or not. So four attributes are these. I will come back to this slide. He called this framework the diamond because These four attributes interact with and reinforce each other, much like 4 points of a diamond shape. In the next slide, we'll look at each of these four attributes closely. Porter's work is different from the earlier theories because it focuses less on countries as a whole and more on why specific industries inside specific countries become world-class. Think of Germany and cars, or Switzerland and watches, as the kind of pattern this theory tries to explain. We came back to diamond. So here are Porter's four attributes, often shown together as diamond diagram. First, factor conditions. This means a nation is positioned in the production factors, like skilled labor, infrastructure, and natural resources. This connects back to the Heckscher-Ohlin idea we discussed earlier, but Porter treats these factors as things a nation can actively build, not just something it happens to have. Second, demand conditions. This is the nature of a home market demand. If local customers are sophisticated and demanding, local firms are pushing to innovate faster. Third, related and supporting industries. Having strong suppliers and related industries nearby creates a whole cluster of expertise that helps everyone improve. Fourth, firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. This describes how companies are organized and, importantly, how intense local competition is. Porter found that fears of domestic competition often makes companies stronger and more competitive globally. Together, these four attributes form the diamond, and Porter argued that strong nations tend to have strength across all 4 points at once. We have now covered the major theories of trade. In our fourth module, we move from theory into real business practice. What happens when trade becomes riskier? For example, during a trade war between two large countries. How do real companies actually respond? This module answers that question with practical detail. This is a great place to slow down and think like a manager rather than an economist. Because these are the exact decisions that global companies are making right now in industries like electronics, automobiles, and agriculture. Let us turn to a very practical question. When investment risk increases, for example, during a trade war, what do businesses actually do? Research shows they typically take three main actions. Let's look at the first one now. The first response is to reduce investment in risky projects. Makes sense. In the context of a trade war, this usually means business invest less money in the countries that are directly involved in the dispute. This makes sense from a risk management point of view. If tariffs might rise sharply, you can look at the phenomenon of trade between US and China. If tariffs might rise sharply, or if the rule of trade might change suddenly, a company does not want too much money tied up in the single uncertain location. This is a completely rational response for individual company. But as we will see soon, it can create real costs for the global economy as a whole. The second response business use is hedging their bets. Hedging simply means spreading out risk so that no single bad outcome can hurt the company too much. For a large global company like Apple, hedging might mean sourcing the same component from several different suppliers in several different countries, rather than relying on just one location. It can also mean assembling final products in more than one country. The advantage of this strategy is flexibility. If a trade dispute suddenly raises tariff barriers in one location, making it less economical, the company can shift some of its production to another location instead, without shutting down completely. Hedging does not only mean spreading production across several foreign countries. Sometimes it means bringing production back home. A firm might choose to increase its domestic production, even if this raises its overall costs, simply to reduce its exposure to tariffs and political risk in other countries. This is a real trade-off. The company accepts higher production costs today in exchange for more certainty and less risk in the future. This kind of decision shows how trade theory connects directly to real corporate strategy. It's not just an abstract economic idea. It shapes where factories get built and how supply chains get designed. The third response businesses often take is lobbying. Lobbying means companies actively try to influence government policy, usually by talking directly with the policymakers or by supporting industry groups that do this work for them. In a trade war situation, companies frequently lobby their own governments to reduce trade barriers, to resolve disputes quickly, and to protect their access to important foreign markets. This is a completely rational business response, since large companies has a lot of stake financially. However, it also shows us that trade policy is never purely about economic theory. It's also shaped by political pressure from powerful business interests. Let's step back and look at the bigger picture. When businesses reduce risky investment, then they hedge by sourcing from multiple locations instead of the most efficient single location. This actually lowers the overall efficiency of how resources are allocated across the global economy. Trade flows can become depressed, meaning there's simply less trade overall, or distorted, meaning trade no longer follows the most efficient pattern that theory would predict. Over time, this can lower economic growth rates for the country involved. This is a powerful lesson. Trade theory is not just an economic exercise from a century ago. When trade risk rises today, for example, during a modern trade war, it creates real, measurable costs for real economies and real companies. Our fifth and final module introduces a set of tools that countries use to measure and track their international trade and investment activity. This is called the balance of payments. Understanding these accounts will help you read real economic news more confidently, since terms like current account and trade deficit appear constantly in business reporting. Even though these accounts sound technical, the underlying idea is simple. They're just a careful bookkeeping system that records money and goods flowing into and out of a country. Every country keeps track of its economic transactions with the rest of the world using what's called the balance of payments account. The balance of payments is simply a national record of all economic transactions between residents of one country and residents of every other country over a certain period of time, usually 1 year. This record is made up of two main parts. The first is the current account. The second is the capital account and financial account. Let's look at each of these separately. The current account tracks the trade of physical goods and services, along with a certain income and payment flows between a country and the rest of the world. This is an account you hear about most often in the news. When a country imports more than its exports, it runs a current account deficit. The United States, for example, has run a current account deficit for many years. Because Americans buy more foreign goods than foreigners buy American goods. When a country exports more than it imports, it runs current account surplus. Some export focus on economies run large surplus year after year. Remember, a deficit is not automatically bad, as a surplus is not automatically good. It depends on the full economic picture of that country. A country can run a deficit for years while still growing strongly. If foreign investors are happy to keep sending money into that country through the financial account instead. The second part of the balance of the payment is made up of the capital account and the financial account. The capital account tracks one limit transfers of assets between countries, such as debt forgiveness or assets that migrants bring with them when they move permanently to a new country. This is usually a fairly small part of the overall balance of payments. The financial account is much larger and more important for our purposes. It tracks the flow of funds used for investment purposes, such as company buying of foreign businesses, an investor buying foreign stocks or bonds, or someone purchasing foreign real estate. Together, the current account and the capital and financial account should balance out, which is exactly why this whole system is called the balance of payment. In practice, statisticians rarely get every number perfectly matched. So you'll often see a small statistical discrepancy line added to make the accounts balance on paper. Before we wrap up, let me do a quick recap of the key terms from this chapter. You should be able to define every term on this slide in your own word. We covered the gains from trade, free trade, new trade theory, mercantilism. We covered the zero-sum game, absolute advantage, factor endowments, economies of scale, first mover advantage, balance of payments, current account, financial account. If any of these terms feel unclear, please go back and review that section before our next class, since these words will keep appearing throughout the rest of the course. Let me summarize what we learned today, point by point. Point 1, mercantilists believed it was a country's best interest to run a trade surplus. They viewed the trade as a zero-sum game, where one country's gain always caused the losses for other countries. Point 2, the theory of absolute advantage from Adam Smith says that countries differ in how efficiently they can produce different products. A country should specialize in producing goods where it holds an absolute advantage, and import goods in areas where other countries hold the advantage instead. These first 2 points set up the whole debate of this chapter. Point three, the theory of comparative advantage from David Ricardo that says that a country should specialize in producing the goods it can make relatively most efficiently. It should buy other goods from trading partners, even if it could technologically produce those goods more efficiently itself. Point four, this leads to the central conclusion of the free trade argument. The theory of competitive advantage shows that unrestricted free trade increases total world production. In other words, trade is a positive sum game, not a zero-sum game. These 4 points taken together explain why economists move so strongly away from mercantilist thinking and towards supporting free trade policy. No single theory fully explains every pattern of trade we see in the real world, but together, these theories complement each other very well. Competitive advantage tells us the productivity differences between countries matter. Factor all-in tells us that a country's resources, its factory endowments matter too. The product life cycle theory tells us that timing matters, meaning where and when a new product gets invented shapes future trade patterns. New trade theory tells us that scale of production and being the first company into the market both matter enormously in modern industries. And Porter's diamond tells us that all of these factors interact together inside the nation's broader business environment. As a manager, you do not need to pick just one theory. You need to recognize which theory best explains the specific industry and situation you're dealing with. Let's close with the managerial takeaway. Trade theory is not simply a piece of economic history that we study for its own sake. It directly explains where companies should locate their production. It explains how companies should manage risk across their global supply chains. It also explains how companies should respond when trade policy suddenly changes, for example, when a new trade war begins. As a future manager, understanding these theories gives you a much stronger foundation for making smart, well-reasoned decisions about where to build factories, where to source materials, and how to plan for political and economic uncertainty. That brings us to the end of today's lecture on international trade theory. Thank you very much for listening to the lecture, and I will see you in the next class.